Witchcraft has long fascinated and terrified societies across the world, serving as a symbol of both mystery and rebellion. Its history stretches back to ancient civilizations and has evolved through centuries of persecution, cultural integration, and eventually acceptance in the modern era. The journey of witchcraft, from ancient rituals to its place in popular culture today, reflects humanity's complex relationship with the supernatural, spirituality, and the unknown. Witchcraft's ancient roots stretch across civilizations, with magic and supernatural practices deeply woven into early societies' beliefs and everyday lives. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradles of civilization, magic was not only accepted but respected. Priests and shamans practiced divination, healing, and exorcism, using magic to ward off evil forces and communicate with the gods. Written records such as the Sumerian incantation texts reveal rituals meant to protect individuals from malevolent spirits, with practitioners considered vital to the community's well-being. For the Mesopotamians, the magic was closely tied to religious practices, and priests and shamans operated as intermediaries between humans and the divine. In ancient Egypt, magic, or Heka, was viewed as a life force intrinsic to the gods and humanity, and the Egyptians believed their gods used magic to create and maintain the universe. Practitioners of magic, often priests or skilled healers, used amulets, spells, and rituals to protect people, cure illnesses, and even extend life. Egyptian artifacts and texts such as the Book of the Dead contain spells intended to guide the deceased through the afterlife and protect them from evil spirits. Gods like Isis and Thoth were especially associated with magical wisdom, and their blessings were thought to empower practitioners. In Egypt, magic was seen as a legitimate practice that could benefit society, and it was respected as a divine gift rather than feared. In ancient Greece and Rome, magic also played a significant role, though it was met with more ambivalence. Greek mythology is rich with stories of powerful sorceresses like Circe and Medea, who used potions, spells, and transformations to exert control over others and alter natural events. However, these figures often represented both fascination and caution. While they possessed immense power, they could also bring about great harm. Greek and Roman society generally accepted certain forms of magic, especially healing, love charms, and protective rituals. But people feared and shunned practices like necromancy or curses, which were seen as morally dubious. Magi, or practitioners who delved into dark magic, were distrusted and sometimes punished. The Greek philosopher Plato even expressed concern over the dangers of magic, emphasizing that it should be controlled to prevent harm. Meanwhile, in ancient China, belief in magic was integrated into Taoist practices, with alchemists and mystics using spells, potions, and symbols to ward off evil and pursue spiritual enlightenment. Taoist sorcerers often combined herbs, minerals, and mystical chants to create medicines or magical protections, while yin-yang philosophy influenced their views on balancing good and evil forces. In ancient China, magic was used for both personal protection and the state's benefit, with emperors consulting astrologers and diviners on matters of national security and prosperity. In these early societies, magic was often seen as a way to harness supernatural forces for positive ends, such as healing, protection, and maintaining harmony with nature. Unlike later periods where magic was feared and persecuted, it was often integrated into religion and culture, with practitioners serving crucial societal roles. These early magical practices, although viewed with a mixture of reverence and caution, provided the foundation for what would later evolve into witchcraft, as mystical beliefs transformed and spread across different cultures and periods. This ancient understanding of magic as a tool for protection, health, and communication with the divine shaped how magic and witchcraft would be perceived and practiced in the centuries that followed. Prior to the witch trials that swept across Europe in the 15th and 17th centuries, witchcraft was viewed with a mixture of reverence, suspicion, and pragmatism. In many communities, magic and supernatural practices were integral to daily life, serving as tools for healing, protection, and ensuring agricultural success. Known as folk magic or cunning craft, these practices were largely informal and passed down through oral tradition. Practitioners, often referred to as cunning folk or wise women and wise men, were respected members of society who played vital roles as healers, midwives, and protectors against malevolent forces. The cunning folk practiced a form of magic focused on the practical needs of rural communities. They used herbs, charms, and spells to treat ailments, ward off illness, and protect livestock. Knowledge of herbal medicine was particularly valuable, and many practitioners could cure common illnesses, deliver babies, and create potions for various purposes. The line between folk magic and early medicine was often blurred, as much of the knowledge was rooted in practical experience and observation of natural remedies. These practitioners were not seen as witches in the later demonized sense, but as valuable contributors to the community welfare. European pagan traditions also influenced early forms of witchcraft. Ancient customs celebrating seasonal changes, such as the winter solstice and harvest festivals, often included rituals, spells, and sacrifices intended to honor the gods and ensure prosperity. The worship of local deities, spirits, and nature itself was central to these practices. Gods of the harvest, fertility, and the changing seasons were invoked to secure good crops, fertility, and protection from natural disasters. Even after the spread of Christianity, many of these rituals persisted in the form of folk customs, as people continued to practice these pagan traditions alongside their new Christian faith. With the rise of Christianity, however, perceptions of magic and witchcraft began to shift. Early Christian leaders sought to distinguish the church's teachings from pagan beliefs and gradually condemned magic as incompatible with Christianity. By the early Middle Ages, the church denounced magical practices as superstitions, and clergy began to associate them with heresy and demonic influence. Although the church tolerated some folk practices, particularly those associated with healing, rituals that invoked pagan deities or spirits were increasingly condemned. Monasteries and convents, which had previously been centers of learning for herbal medicine, gradually distanced themselves from practices that appeared too magical or pagan. However, in many rural areas, old customs and folk practices persisted. People continued to rely on wise women, midwives, and healers for guidance in times of need. These individuals were consulted for everything from treating sickness to finding lost items or predicting the weather. It wasn't uncommon for villagers to visit cunning folk for blessings, charms, and love spells. In most cases, these practices were not perceived as inherently evil, but were seen as practical tools to address life's uncertainties, filling a spiritual gap that organized religion didn't fully address. During this period, alchemy and astrology also flourished in Europe. Alchemists and astrologers were often regarded as scholars and pursued their craft with the belief that they could unlock the mysteries of the natural world. Figures like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus practiced forms of natural magic, aiming to understand and harness the forces of nature rather than summoning supernatural beings. Alchemists sought to transmute base metals into gold and discover the elixir of life, while astrologers mapped celestial patterns to predict earthly events. Though some viewed their work as mystical, it was generally tolerated by the church when framed as an exploration of God's creation. Witchcraft, therefore, was not yet feared or condemned as inherently evil. Rather, it was woven into the fabric of rural and even intellectual life. But by the late medieval period, changes in social, political, and religious dynamics would set the stage for the infamous witch hunts. As the church consolidated power, it began to equate certain magical practices with heresy and the influence of the devil, labeling witches as heretics in league with Satan. This shift paved the way for the brutal persecutions that would later sweep across Europe, transforming wise women, cunning folk, and folk healers from respected figures into scapegoats for society's fears and misfortunes. The European witch hunts, which reached their peak between the 15th and 18th centuries, are one of the most tragic and infamous chapters in the history of witchcraft. During this period, a potent mixture of religious zeal, political control, and social unrest led to the persecution of thousands of people, primarily women, who were accused of practicing witchcraft. The hunts began in Western Europe, where belief in witchcraft was already prevalent, but intensified with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487. Written by German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this book, whose title translates to The Hammer of Witches, served as a guide for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches, and became a foundation for witch hunts across Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum labeled witches as dangerous heretics who serve the devil, casting spells to harm crops, livestock, and even humans. The book detailed methods of extracting confessions, which often included brutal torture, and recommended the death penalty as the primary punishment. This influential text fueled a wave of hysteria as people began to believe that witches were responsible for society's misfortunes, including natural disasters, famine, and disease. Accusations of witchcraft were often based on flimsy evidence, gossip, and hearsay. Women were particularly vulnerable as they were seen as morally weaker and more susceptible to the devil's influence. Regions such as Germany, Switzerland, and France became hotbeds for witch trials. Germany in particular experienced some of the deadliest witch hunts, with the trials in Würzburg and Bamberg leading to the execution of hundreds. Witch hunts often targeted those on the fringes of society: widows, healers, midwives, and the elderly, who were perceived as different or suspicious. Once accused, these individuals had little chance of escaping the charges, as the trials relied heavily on forced confessions obtained through torture. Instruments like the thumbscrew, strappado, and even swimming tests were employed, with those found guilty typically burned at the stake, a punishment that served as both an execution and a public spectacle. The witch hunts were further intensified by religious tensions brought about by the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation. As Protestant and Catholic authorities vied for control over Europe, both sides condemned witchcraft, linking it to heresy and the devil. In Protestant regions, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin preached against witchcraft, while Catholic authorities, including the Inquisition, sought to root out heretical beliefs and practices. This shared condemnation allowed witch hunts to transcend religious divides, as both Protestants and Catholics viewed witchcraft as an evil that needed to be eradicated. Local rulers and officials often encouraged witch trials as a means of asserting their authority and reinforcing social order, using fear of witchcraft to control populations and suppress dissent. The most infamous witch trial in England was that of the Pendle Witches in 1612, where 12 people from the Pendle Hill area were accused of witchcraft. The trial highlighted the role that socioeconomic factors played in the witch hunts, as family rivalries, land disputes, and tensions between rich and poor often fueled accusations. Similarly, in Scotland, witch trials were frequent, with around 4,000 people executed under King James VI, who had a particular interest in witchcraft and even wrote a book, Daemonology, condemning it. Scotland's witch hunts often targeted women and men who were accused of practicing maleficium, harmful magic meant to cause illness or misfortune. The hysteria and witch trials that began in Europe eventually spread to the American colonies, where the Salem witch trials in 1692 became the most infamous witch hunt in American history. In Salem, Massachusetts, a combination of religious extremism, isolation, and social tensions led to the accusations of witchcraft against local residents. What began as accusations among young girls quickly spiraled into a frenzy, resulting in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of many more. The Salem trials echoed the practices of the European witch hunts, with spectral evidence, testimony that the spirit of the accused was seen committing witchcraft, used as proof of guilt. The Salem trials would mark the last large-scale witch hunt in colonial America, with later generations viewing it as a tragic example of mass hysteria. By the late 17th century, as the Age of Enlightenment introduced more rational and scientific thinking, the fervor surrounding witch hunts began to fade. Skepticism about the supernatural, coupled with criticism of the brutal methods used in trials, led to a gradual decline in witch persecutions. Influential thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke criticized the use of torture and superstition to justify executions, shifting the cultural perspective on witchcraft. laws against witchcraft were slowly repealed, with the last known execution for witchcraft in Europe occurring in Switzerland in 1782. The European witch hunts left deep scars on society, with tens of thousands of people executed, many of them innocent. They exposed the dangers of fear-driven persecution and the vulnerability of marginalized individuals. Today, historians view the witch hunts as a complex phenomenon influenced by religious, social, and political factors, a tragic reminder of the consequences of mass hysteria and the darker side of humanity's search for answers to life's uncertainties. While witchcraft in Europe took on a dark and often demonized tone, other cultures viewed witchcraft and magical practices differently. In Africa, witchcraft is part of a complex cultural framework where healers known as sangomas, or witch doctors, play important roles in community health, guidance, and spirituality. African witchcraft is often a dualistic concept, with white witches providing healing and protection, and black witches believed to bring misfortune or illness. Despite the cultural differences, accusations of witchcraft still lead to persecution in some African regions today. In indigenous North and South American cultures, witchcraft and magic were also present in shamanistic practices. Shamans, who held knowledge of herbal medicine, spiritual healing, and rituals, were respected as community leaders and healers. In Asia, magic and witchcraft took on unique forms influenced by local religions. For example, in parts of India, practitioners of black magic, known as tantrics, were feared and respected for their knowledge of rituals that could harm or heal. In Japan, folklore describes supernatural beings like kitsune, foxes, who were believed to possess humans, and onmyoji, practitioners of divination who dealt with spirits and the supernatural. These varied cultural perspectives illustrate that witchcraft has been perceived in numerous ways across societies. Rather than being solely feared, witches and shamans in many cultures were respected figures with specialized knowledge of herbs, healing, and the spiritual realm. These practices, in turn, help shape each society's approach to illness, spirituality, and community well-being. The occult revival of the 19th and 20th centuries was a pivotal period that reshaped witchcraft from a persecuted and marginalized practice into a respected, even celebrated spiritual path. This revival emerged during the Victorian era, a time when Western societies were fascinated with the supernatural, mysticism, and the exploration of ancient knowledge. The revival was fueled by influential figures like Helena Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, and Gerald Gardner, whose ideas reintroduced magic and the occult into popular culture, sparking a renewed interest in witchcraft and other esoteric practices. Helena Blavatsky was one of the first major figures of this movement. As the co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875, she aimed to blend Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, focusing on mysticism, reincarnation, and the exploration of hidden knowledge. Blavatsky's work inspired curiosity about ancient religions, magic, and the occult, opening the door for people to explore non-Christian spiritualities and esoteric traditions. Through her teachings and books such as The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky inspired a generation of seekers to explore alternative beliefs, sparking what would become a broader spiritual reawakening. Another highly influential figure was Aleister Crowley, known as the Great Beast. Crowley was a British occultist and ceremonial magician who created his own mystical philosophy, Thelema, based on the ideas of pursuing one's true will. Crowley's flamboyant lifestyle and boundary-pushing practices, including rituals and magic, were controversial, but he helped bring occult concepts such as ritual magic, spellcasting, and astrology into the public consciousness. His work laid the groundwork for modern witchcraft practices, and his influence persists in modern occultism. Books like The Book of the Law provided a theoretical foundation for a new wave of occult practitioners who viewed magic as a tool for self-empowerment and spiritual enlightenment, rather than something inherently dangerous or malevolent. However, the most influential figure in the formalization of modern witchcraft was Gerald Gardner, who is often credited as the founder of Wicca. Gardner, a British civil servant, was deeply interested in ancient religions, folklore, and magic. In the 1950s, he began practicing and promoting Wicca as a nature-based spiritual path, incorporating elements of ceremonial magic, folklore, and ancient pagan rituals. Gardner's teachings emphasize the reverence of nature, the celebration of the changing seasons, and the practice of ethical magic. Gardner introduced rituals, ceremonies, and the concept of the Wiccan Rede, and at harm none, do what ye will, which encouraged witches to practice their craft responsibly and without harm to others. Wicca quickly gained followers and grew into one of the most widely practiced forms of neo-paganism, sparking an enduring movement. The occult revival also included a broader reawakening of interest in ancient deities, nature worship, and magical practices. Many people began to explore neo-paganism, a movement that sought to revive pre-Christian religious practices and beliefs. Neo-paganism encompassed various paths, including Wicca, Druidry, and heathenry, each drawing upon different ancient cultural and religious traditions. Neo-pagans sought a spiritual path that celebrated nature, the cycles of the earth, and personal empowerment through ritual and magic. This revival was not only spiritual but also political, as it reflected a growing rejection of traditional religious authority in favor of individual freedom and exploration. The 1960s and 70s brought a countercultural wave that further propelled witchcraft into the mainstream, as people, particularly women, sought alternatives to conventional religious beliefs and social norms. The feminist movement embraced witchcraft as a symbol of female empowerment and independence, rejecting the historical portrayal of witches as evil and instead reclaiming them as wise healers, midwives, and powerful women. This period saw the birth of the goddess movement, which emphasized the worship of feminine deities and celebrated women's spiritual roles. The image of the witch evolved from a symbol of fear to one of empowerment and spiritual autonomy. The occult revival also led to an explosion of literature on witchcraft, with books like Raymond Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft and Scott Cunningham's Wicca, a guide for the solitary practitioner, providing accessible instructions to witchcraft, spells, and ritual practice. These books popularized Wicca and modern witchcraft, making the practices accessible to those outside traditional covens and encouraging solitary practice. Additionally, the spread of witchcraft literature allowed practitioners to study spells, rituals, and divination techniques from home, leading to the development of a vibrant international community of witches. By the late 20th century, witchcraft had fully entered popular culture, appearing in films, TV shows, and novels that portrayed witches as powerful, independent, and often misunderstood individuals. Movies like The Craft in 1996 and television shows like Charmed in 1998 introduced a new generation to the ideas of witchcraft, while J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series brought magic and wizardry to the forefront of young adult literature. These portrayals helped to normalize and popularize witchcraft, portraying it as a mystical yet approachable practice. Today, the legacy of the occult revival is evident in the growth of online witchcraft communities, neo-pagan festivals, and the mainstream acceptance of practices like tarot reading, crystal healing, and astrology. The revival transformed witchcraft from a feared and persecuted practice to a respected, diverse, and often highly individualized spiritual path. Modern witchcraft, influenced by the teachings of Blavatsky, Crowley, Gardner, and countless others, is now celebrated as a vibrant, living tradition that embraces the ancient wisdom of nature, the power of ritual, and the magic within the self. From ancient rituals and protective spells to the hysteria of the European witch hunts, the history of witchcraft reveals a complex journey shaped by fear, reverence, and cultural shifts. What began as an ancient practice integrated into daily life became demonized under Christian influence, leading to centuries of persecution. Yet in recent history, witchcraft has experienced a revival, gaining recognition as a spiritual path and cultural symbol. Today, witchcraft represents both a historical legacy and a living tradition, embodying humanity's ongoing fascination with the unknown, the mystical, and the power of the natural world. The journey of witchcraft from feared practice to accepted spirituality reflects a broader evolution in how societies understand and relate to the unseen forces that shape our lives.